Zulu Dawn is a 1979 adventure war film about the Battle of Isandlwana between the British forces and Zulus in 1879. The screenplay was by Cy Endfield and is a prequel to Zulu, released in 1964, which depicts the Battle of Rorke's Drift later that same day, and which also was co-written and directed by Cy Endfield. But how truthful is the movie to the real events upon which it is based? So sit back and relax as we reveal the truth behind the movie, Zulu Dawn. The film opens in the Cape Colony in January 1879 with Lord Chelmsford plotting with diplomat Sir Henry Battle Frere to annex the neighbouring Zulu Empire, which they perceive as a threat to the Cape Colony's emerging industrial economy. The movie captures the attitude of Chelmsford and Frere well. The real pretext for the war had its origins in border disputes between the Zulu leader Chetshwayo and the Boers in the Transvaal region. Following a commission inquiry on the border dispute, which reported in favour of the Zulu nation in July 1878, Sir Henry Battle Frere, acting on his own, added an ultimatum to the commission meeting, much to the surprise of the Zulu representatives, who then relayed it to Chetshwayo. Chetshwayo had not responded by the end of the year, so an extension was granted by Battle Frere until the 11th of January 1879. Chetshwayo returned no answer to the demands of Battle Frere, and in January 1879 a British force under the command of Lord Chelmsford invaded Zululand without authorisation by the British government. Chelmsford formed his army into three invading columns, with the main centre column consisting of some 7,800 men under his direct command. He moved his troops from Pietermaritzburg to a forward camp at Helpmekaar, past Greytown. On the 9th of January 1879 they moved to Rorke's Drift, and early on the 11th of January commenced crossing the Buffalo River into Zululand. While Chetshwayo's army numbered perhaps 35,000 warriors, it was essentially a militia force which could be called out in times of national danger. He had very limited logistical capacity and could only have stayed in the field for a few weeks before the troops would be obliged to return to their civilian duties. Zulu warriors were armed primarily with the assegai thrusting spears, clubs, some throwing spears and shields made of cowhide. It was because of the British technological advantage that the movie portrays Chelmsford and his staff as arrogant and overconfident, treating the campaign as an excursion assured of victory.
Had it drummed into my thick skull that a good commander never willingly splits his force, especially in an enemy's country, before knowing their dispositions.
Yes, if we were facing a European enemy armed with guns, I think your point would hold, Noggs.
The British Expeditionary Force marches into the Zulu Empire, with Lord Chelmsford directing it towards the Zulu capital Ulundi. Eager to bring the war to a swift conclusion, the British become increasingly frustrated as the Zulu military refuse to engage in a pitched battle, with only a few minor skirmishes. But in reality, the initial entry of all three columns was unopposed. Halfway to Ulundi, Lord Chelmsford ordered the British forces to make camp at the base of Mount Isandlwana, ignoring the advice of his Boer attendants to fortify the camp and transform his supply wagons into a laager. On 22nd of January, the centre was encamped near Isandlwana. On the morning of that day, Lord Chelmsford split his forces and moved out to support a reconnoitring party, leaving the camp in charge of Colonel Pauline. The British were outmanoeuvred by the main Zulu army, nearly 20,000 strong. Chelmsford was lured eastwards with much of his centre column by a Zulu diversionary force, while the main impi attacked his camp. Chelmsford's decision not to set up the British camp defensively, contrary to established doctrine, and ignoring information that the Zulus were close at hand, were decisions that the British were soon to regret. The Zulu attack then developed into a pitched battle, with the traditional horns and chest of the buffalo, with the aims of encircling the British position. From Pauline's vantage point in the camp, at first only the right horn and then the chest of the attack seemed to be developing. Pauline sent out first one, then all 6 companies of the 24 foot into an extended firing line with the aim of meeting the Zulu attack head on and checking it with firepower. Durnford's men, upon meeting elements of the Zulu centre, had retreated to a dried out watercourse on the British right flank, where they formed a defensive line. Pauline only made one change to the original disposition after about 20 minutes of firing, bringing in the companies in the firing line slightly closer to the camp. For an hour or so, until afternoon, the disciplined British volleys pinned down the Zulu centre, inflicting many casualties and causing the advance to stall. Indeed, morale remained high within the British line. The Martini Henry rifle was a powerful weapon, and the men were experienced. Additionally, the shell fire of the Royal Artillery forced some Zulu regiments to take cover behind a reverse slope of a hill. Nevertheless, the left horn of the Zulu advance was moving to outflank and envelop the British right. The movie portrays the initial view of Horace Smith Dorrien that the British had difficulty unpacking their ammunition boxes fast enough. The box lids were screwed down and the screws were rusty and difficult to remove. There were also too few screwdrivers, and standing orders insisted that until a box was empty, no other boxes were to be opened, and the quartermasters were reluctant to distribute ammunition to units other than their own. Well-equipped and well-trained British soldiers could fire 10 to 12 rounds a minute. The lack of ammunition caused a lull in the defence, and in subsequent engagements with the Zulus, ammunition boxes were unscrewed in advance for rapid distribution. But numerous first-hand accounts, including Smith Dorrien's earliest letter to his father, indicate ammunition was available and being supplied. Donald Morris in The Washing of the Spears argues that the men, fighting too far from the camp, ran out of ammunition, starting first with Durnford's men who were holding the right flank and who had been in action longer, which precipitated a slowdown in the rate of fire against the Zulus. This argument suggests that the ammunition was too far from the firing line and that the 70 rounds each man took to the firing line were not sufficient. A different view, supported with evidence from the battlefield, such as Ian Knight and Lieutenant Colonel Snook's works, suggests that, although Durnford's men probably did run out of ammunition, the majority of men in the firing line did not. The discovery of the British line so far out from the camp has led Ian Knight to conclude that the British were defending too large a perimeter. But what the movie totally misses out is the solar eclipse on that day, which one Zulu warrior described. The sun turned black in the middle of the battle. We could still see it over us, or should have thought we had been fighting till evening. Then we got into camp, and there was a great deal of smoke and firing. Afterwards, the sun came out bright again. The movie shows the British making a number of last stands, and this is supported by the presence of large numbers of bodies grouped together, suggests the resistance was more protracted than originally thought, and several desperate last stands were made. Evidence shows that many of the bodies, today marked by cairns, were found in several large groups around the camp, including one stand of around 150 men. A Zulu account describes a group of the 24 forming square at the neck of Isandlwana, and colonial cavalry, the NMP and their carbiners, who could have easily fled as they were on horses, died around Durnford in his last stand, while nearby their horses were found dead on their picket rope. What is clear is that the slaughter was complete in the area around the camp and back to Natal along Fugitives Drift. The fighting had been hand-to-hand combat and no quarter was given to the British regulars. The Zulus had been commanded to ignore civilians in black coats. This meant that some officers, whose patrol dress was dark blue and black at the time, were spared and escaped. The movie shows the British commander, Colonel Pauline, entrusting a regimental colour to his soldiers who attempt to carry it to safety back to the Cape Colony. They passed numerous dead and dying British soldiers during their journey. Eventually, reaching the Buffalo River, the British soldiers are discovered and killed by Zulu warriors. The colour is captured by a Zulu. One of the British soldiers, who lies mortally wounded, shoots and kills the Zulu wielding the colour, who drops it into the river, where it floats out of reach of the Zulu force. This, of course, is partly fiction. Both the colours of the second 24th were lost, while the Queen's colour of the first 24th was carried off the field by Lieutenant Melville on horseback, but lost when he crossed the river, despite Lieutenant Coghill having come to his aid. Both Melville and Coghill were killed after crossing the river and later received Victoria Crosses in 1907. 2 weeks after the battle, Coghill and Melville's bodies were found by a search party and both buried at Fugitives Drift. The colour which Coghill and Melville tried to save was recovered and is on display at Brecon Cathedral in remembrance of their valour, as well as the other soldiers that were killed during the battle. Coghill's Victoria Cross is permanently displayed at the Regimental Museum of the Royal Welsh in Brecon, Wales. Of the 1,800 plus force of British troops and African auxiliaries, over 1,300 were killed, most of them Europeans, including Field Commanders Pauline and Durnford. There was no casualty count of the Zulu losses by the British, such as made in many of the other battles since they abandoned the field, nor was there any count of the Zulus. Modern historians have rejected and reduced the older unfounded estimates. Historians Locke and Quintrell estimate the Zulu casualties as perhaps between 1,500 and 2,000 dead. Chelmsford realised that he would need to account to the government and to history for the disaster. He quickly fixed blame on Durnford, claiming Durnford disobeyed his orders to fix a proper defensive camp, although there is no evidence such an order was issued, and there would hardly have been time for Durnford to entrench. Further, it had been Chelmsford's decision not to entrench the camp, as it was meant to be temporary. Following the war's conclusion and his return to Great Britain, Chelmsford sought an audience with Gladstone, who had become Prime Minister in April 1880, but his request was refused, a very public slight and a clear sign of official disapproval. Chelmsford, however, obtained an audience with Queen Victoria to personally explain the events. She asked Gladstone to meet Chelmsford. This meeting was brief, and during it Gladstone voiced his displeasure. The official interrogation by Horse Guards under the direction of the Duke of Cambridge, the Field Marshal Commanding-in-Chief, in August 1879 concluded that the primary cause of the defeat was the underestimate formed of the offensive fighting power of the Zulu army. Additionally, the investigation questions Chelmsford as to why the camp was not laagered and why there was a failure to scout and discover the nearby Zulu army. Zulu Dawn stays as a whole truthful to the events around the Battle of Isandlwana and is certainly worth watching. There are a few small inaccuracies, such as the smaller Martini Henry carbines being used by the infantry, and the fact that the Queen's colours were not cased when being carried to safety. But these minor inaccuracies don't make the movie any less enjoyable.